After Penny Sparrow, formerly a random estate agent from KwaZulu-Natal, was quickly converted into a national icon of the evil that is white racism, the ANC vowed to stop racism with new legislation that would be tough on racists. If the ANC gets its way by turning the proposed Prevention and Combating of Hate Crimes and Hate Speech Bill into an Act of Parliament, people who commit hate speech could be imprisoned for several years. Now, who could possibly be against the idea that racism must be combated? Well, as it turns out, a lot of people are, at least against the way in which the ANC proposes to do it. The problem with this bill, among others, is that the definition of hate speech, which would become a crime, is so broad that it even includes the insulting of people based on their occupation. This effectively means that insulting jokes about lawyers or venting your anger about government employees could lead to your imprisonment, or that most comedians and cartoonists would be imprisoned. The right to freedom of speech as we know it would effectively be destroyed. This brings up the old question: are there limits to freedom of speech, and if so, what are these limits? The constitutionality of this bill has already been seriously questioned, and AfriForum has already submitted inputs to this effect and vows to take this legislation to the Constitutional Court, should it be approved by Parliament and the President. To discuss these issues with us today is Advocate Mark Oppenheimer, freedom of speech expert and the man contracted to draft AfriForum submissions to Parliament. We also welcome Jeremy Nell, the famous cartoonist better known as Germ. Gentlemen, thank you very much. Advocate Oppenheimer, if I can start with you, maybe if you can just give a brief outline of this bill and also what you believe the main concerns with this bill would be.
So I think we should start off by considering what the Constitution defines as free speech and what it defines as hate speech. So the Constitution provides very generous rights to free speech: freedom of the press, freedom of artistic creativity, freedom of scientific endeavor, and there are only three kinds of speech that are prohibited. So the first is propaganda for war, the second is incitement of imminent violence, and the third is advocacy of hatred on one of four listed grounds: race, ethnicity, gender, and religion, and that constitutes incitement to cause harm. So that last one is what we generally understand to be hate speech. So speech that falls inside that category is not protected by the Constitution. However, what the bill does is it defines hate speech in a much broader manner. So instead of looking at this idea of inciting harm against others, what it talks about is speech that's insulting or speech that aims to ridicule others. And it imposes very draconian penalties for breaching this. So if you tell an off-color lawyer joke, you can wind up spending 3 years in prison for the first offense and 10 years for the second. Furthermore, what the bill does is it criminalizes the reporting of hate speech. So even if there are genuine acts of hate speech, which the public would want to know about, so everyone has the right to access to information, it'll be a crime for reporters to report on those words and may themselves find themselves in prison. There's also a move to censor things that are understood as hate speech, which will include historical books about the Rwandan genocide, about the Holocaust, because they're going to contain excerpts of hate speech. Of course, because the bill is incredibly broad, it'll include the annual collections of Zapiro's works. Germ's cartoons as well will be endangered. It'll be a criminal offence to stock these materials. It'll also have an effect on religious texts. So there are numerous extracts from the Quran, the Torah, and the New Testament that breach this broad definition of hate speech. So making those religious texts available would also be a crime, and preaching from them would be a crime.
So if I have a book on my shelf about the Rwandan genocide, which lists some of the things that has been said about the Tutsis, for example, about being cockroaches and so forth, owning that book would be a crime. Or if you had a bookstore and you were selling those books, you wouldn't be allowed to do so. Is that correct?
Yes, so the language of the bill is that if you make it publicly available, that's the crime. So you may have an anomalous case where as a private person who keeps it locked up, you would be okay, but as the bookstore you wouldn't. But it seems quite important for us to not lose sight of genuine acts of hate speech and genuine atrocities against humankind. We must recognize that one of the best counters to hateful speech is counter-dialogue, and that racists, bigots and homophobes don't do very well in strong light and clean air, that when their views are publicly expressed, they are shown up for the hateful vitriol that they are. And so it's important that we know who they are, that we give them the space to announce themselves so that we can deal with them appropriately. When we suppress that speech, we drive them underground, and often they rise up in very pernicious, violent ways.
Well, talking about counter speech, coming to you, Jeremy, about the role that cartoonists have to play. People are often offended by some of the things that people draw that you see in the newspaper. Do you believe that there's space for that in the first place? And in the second place, do you believe that legislation should be in place to regulate, for example, the work of cartoonists?
Well, as Mark said, if we don't know who the racists and the homophobes, etc., are, then I wouldn't be able to ridicule them. And ridicule is a great way of exposing people. It's much more fun and more effective to expose people through the same speech that they're offered. And as Mark said, they don't do very well when that occurs. So I think it's very important to be able to ridicule, with very little legislation. And I don't think legislation will have too much positive impact on satire, because satire in itself is all about insulting and ridicule and many other metaphorical devices. It's a slippery slope that's based on concepts and not tangible entities that with which we can relate, and it all becomes about interpretation and what people get offended by and their feelings being hurt, that kind of thing, and definitions seem to fall away.
Well, Mark, one of the things in this bill that's now going into the parliamentary process is it says that the Director of Public Prosecutions can decide who should be prosecuted and who shouldn't. Do you think that is an appropriate clause to add in a bill such as this?
It's a particularly frightening clause, because what it does is that it allows those in power to persecute those they deem to be their enemies. So you can have two people saying exactly the same thing, both of which qualify as hate speech in terms of legislation, but only the one person gets prosecuted and incarcerated. So what you might find is that if the ANC is in power, that ANC members who commit acts of hate speech aren't punished, but members of the DA and the EFF are. Of course, there's a danger that once the legislation is in place, that those that take power later can use it against the new political enemies. So it's always important for government, when drafting legislation, to bear in mind that there are changes in regimes, and that the very tools that they craft can be used against them later on. They should be very wary of crafting weapons that are dangerous.
Jeremy, you are a special type of political commentator, being a cartoonist. And so in that sense, do you believe that racism or hate speech is a problem in South Africa? And if so, and if you disagree with this bill, where do you think the problem lies, or how do you think it should be fixed, other than having a bill that puts people in prison?
Well, I don't think racism is nearly the problem that the media will have us believe. The data that's come out of the Institute of Race Relations tends to show that most South Africans actually don't care much about racism. They care more about living a better life and getting on with things. Actually having a better life for all. The people who are the loudest tend to be the minority, and social media has I definitely think driven that voice. But I think people will still be vocal about such things, but I think it's more to do with culturalism rather than racism. Although, as I said, those lines get a bit blurry. But yeah, the data does seem to show that people aren't as interested in racism as I said, the media would have us believe. So,
Mark, also in your presentation, you had a reference or a comparison between the very well-known case of Penny Sparrow and that of the lesser-known case of Velapi Kumalu. Can you maybe just elaborate on that? What are the differences between those two, and what would the consequences be for these people if this bill were to be enacted?
So I think it's important to draw a distinction between hateful speech and hate speech. So hateful speech is racist speech that is protected by the Constitution, and genuine hate speech has this call to action this incitement of harm or violence that is also hateful speech. Now, in the case of Penny Sparrow, what she says is undoubtedly racist. She compares black people to monkeys. It's insulting. I can see how people would be upset about it, but there's no call to action. She never says that the monkeys on the beach ought to be exterminated or that we ought to do something about black people. She merely says her racist thing. What Valapi Kumalo says in response to her tweet is that we should do to white people what Hitler did to the Jews. In other words, calling for a genocide to exterminate white people. Now there what you have is the advocacy of hatred on the grounds of race, and also this call to action that people need to rise up and actively kill white people and put them in ovens, gas them, shoot them. This clearly falls into the category of genuine hate speech. And in the submission that we drafted, we draw the distinction quite clearly. We think that it's permissible for the state to clamp down on genuine acts of hate speech. The problem is when you define hate speech in an irregular way that's not in terms of the Constitution. It's a tactic used by the apartheid regime in the Suppression of Communism Act, that legislation was used to supposedly suppress communist ideas, but it was also used to suppress any ideas that the state didn't like. And a very similar thing will happen with this legislation.
But this isn't a law yet, so maybe just to conclude, what would the way forward be for this bill to become a law?
So the first process is the submission process. So we've submitted our presentation to Parliament, which is written. We're then hoping to be invited to have an oral presentation of that, alongside with other civic rights organisations, and we can speak to the dangers of this legislation. And I gather that already people are starting to speak out against it. PNSA released a statement this morning pointing out the dangers of the legislation. What may then happen is that the parliamentary body can adjust the bill at that point. After seeing comments from the public, after the hearing process, they may reintroduce different legislation. However, after the hearing process, they may change nothing. And they may then try and pass the bill through Parliament and ultimately have it signed by President and enacting it. At that point, the move will be to challenge the constitutionality of it, which of course is an expensive process for those that are prosecuted under it, and a demeaning process for those that are vilified and charged with crimes when they haven't done anything that's morally problematic or unconstitutional.
Thank you very much. Jeremy Nell, Advocate Mark Oppenheimer, thank you for joining us today, and we will certainly follow this issue going forward. And from AfriForum, we will certainly continue with our campaign, also to put inputs into this bill. Thank you very much.